Hi, welcome to this workshop I call What, So What, Now What? And I'm presenting it for a very particular reason. I believe this is a belly of the whale time for the church. Like Jonah, this is our time to think about how we respond to God's calling. I believe God is nudging the church to reflect on the Missio Dei, the mission of God, on the church's calling as a strategy of God, on how we are responding to God's call, and to reconsider and revise how we do church. I think this is a moment when we are to rethink church. Many respected observers of the church in North America have said that ours is a transitional time between how the church has been to how the church shall be. So over these 3 weeks, we're going to look at 3 things. This week, what, is setting the stage by looking at church decline and its reasons. We'll be delving into sociology here. I will be concise, frank, and honest. I hope you find that what I share tonight is challenging and even disturbing. I want you to feel like James Bond's martini. I don't want you just to be stirred. I want you to be shaken. Despite 60 years of change for the church, most congregations are not taking this change seriously, to their detriment. Next week, so what? This is about models for being church. And this will lean more into ecclesiology, that is the theology of church. So next week we will, 1, look at a model of church that is predominated for us for 1,600 years, especially the last 300 years. 2nd, why this model has been failing us since the Second World War. Look at an emerging model of church, missional church, and why that is perhaps a more relevant self-understanding for us for today. The final week, now what? We're going to look at some emerging examples of church doing church in new ways. Over the past 20 years, it has been a time of experimentation, and we have found a growing number of emerging style churches that are pretty relevant for our societal situation today and for tomorrow. I'm going to introduce you to several of those congregations. So my goal over these 3 weeks is to help you acknowledge, like Toto, that, I want to help you acknowledge, like Dorothy, that Toto, I got a feeling that we aren't in Kansas anymore. I want to help us see that the model of church we have been using is no longer serving us, and to be encouraged to find hope in examples of many congregations around us who are living out new ways of being church. So let's jump in. This presentation is going to be about 50 minutes tonight, and then we'll have discussion. So what's been happening in the last 60 years? Let's take a look at the changing church in Canada. And one way to observe that is by looking at worship attendance in this country. So here's a polling question that the Gallup organization asked in Canada in 1946. And the question was, did you attend public worship in the past 7 days? So in 1946, the answer was 67% of Canadians attended worship in the last week. And Angus Reid Polling has done a great service to us, and that in December 2013, it asked the very same question again and did a national poll. And what they found was 13%. Now, this is a decline in worship attendance of 80%. So, what's happening here? Why has this happened? Well, two main reasons. First point, we are losing our own out of churches at an ever-increasing rate. Let's look at people who identify as mainline Christians. These are people who say, I am a Christian. I see myself as a Christian. I also see myself as a United Church member or Presbyterian, Anglican, Lutheran, mainline church Christians. And let's see how church involvement has changed for them. So the question asked by Reg Bibby in 1996 was, how often did you attend religious services in the past 12 months? And again, these are people who say, I'm a Christian, I'm Anglican, I'm Presbyterian, I'm United. And this is what they said. 26% in 1996 said they never attend worship at all. They still think of themselves as Christian. They still say, I'm Presbyterian, I'm Lutheran, I'm Anglican. But despite that, fully a quarter of the people that way never ever went to church, even though they identified that way still. Those going once or more a month, 23%. Those who are going weekly, 20%. Now, let's zoom ahead. Again, Angus Reid Polling has done a big service to us, asking the very same question again in 2013. Note the dramatic change in 17 years. Those who say, I never go, 52%. Again, these are people who say, I think of myself as a Christian. I think of myself as Presbyterian, Anglican, United. And yet, half of those now not going to church at all. Those going once or more a month, down by 2/3 to 8%. Those going weekly have declined by a half to 10%. Now, something we need to remember here, in the polling in 2013, it doesn't ask what religion you participate when you go to worship. And so in 2013, it would have included Hindus, Sikhs, Muslim, Buddhists, because Canada's become multi-religious. In 1946 or 1996, it would be less than that. So we see that we've got this great shift happening specifically among mainline church people. And what seems to be happening is that mainline church people are fading out of involvement. So basically, going weekly, over time, going a couple of times a month, over time, going like Christmas and Easter, over time, not going at all. Still saying I'm a Christian, still saying I'm Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian, but just not going at all. So we are losing our own. A substantial, growing number of people who identify as mainline Christians are simply choosing to attend less over time. So this raises a question. Why are they dropping out? I'm going to pause the video here and just ask you to just drop your own answers into the chat box. There seem to be three main reasons why people are dropping out. One, participation in the church has become less and less meaningful for a growing number of people. Second, the church has not done enough to help people sustain their faith in a societal culture that is actually corrosive to the Christian faith. And the third group have been labeled the Dones, D-O-N-E-S, those who are done with church. They simply had it with church. Now, this is not news. We have seen this happen more and more in the experience of the church, basically starting with the baby boomers. I just want to ask a question for you to answer for yourself. Have you raised children and brought them up in the church, but those children now grown are no longer involved in church or no longer involved with the Christian faith? I've asked this question in many, many workshops, and always the large majority of people put up their hand in response, because this is a trend that has affected us all. It's not because any of us did a poor job in raising our children to have the Christian faith. It's rather we did not appreciate how substantial the influence our society has in drawing younger people away from faith. So these realities raise three questions, and three natural questions the church has to think about. First, what are we doing to help people find greater meaning in their faith and in their church involvement? Second, what are we doing to help people have a faith that can sustain and withstand the societal pressure to let that go? And third, how are we treating those who are bored out of church, burned out of church, or bummed out by something that happened at church? I will pause here for comments. So point number one, we are losing our own at an ever-increasing rate. The second point is there's a growing portion of our society that is not holding a Christian faith for a couple of reasons. But the cause of that is that society is no longer our partner in fostering and sustaining Christian faith. I'll say that again. Society is no longer our partner in fostering and sustaining the Christian faith. Let's take a look at some data from the Canadian Census talking about religious affiliation. And the Canadian Stats Canada has been asking this question now for 50 years. And we see a growing number of people who are registered as having no religion. So take a look at the change here in the stats. From 1971, 4% of the population said, I have no religion. Decade 11, later, 7%, 12%, 16%. So between 1991 2001, up by a third. Between 2001 to 2011, up by 50%. From 2011 to 2021, that is up about a third again. Why is this dramatic growth in the nuns happening? Primary reason? Mainline Christians dropping their Christian identification. Remember in that last body of numbers we looked at? Those were people who said, I am a Christian, I'm Presbyterian, I'm United, I'm Anglican, Lutheran. And the number of people who are just, the growing number of people who believed that about themselves, identified this way themselves, but never ever went to church. Well, within that group, we have people who are just dropping that self-identification. They just no longer see themselves as Christian or Presbyterian. Sociologists call them nunverts. They are converts to the nun category, nunverts. But there's also a growing number of Canadian citizens, predominantly younger generations, who never had any religion at all. One really telling thing is Reg Bibby, in a survey he did of Canadian youth in 2008, found that 47% of Canadian teenagers claimed that they never attended a worship service ever in their life of any kind, including funerals and weddings, of any religion. 47%. Those teenagers in 2008 are now our millennials. So what has changed? When I was growing up, like many of you, the public school day began with a Bible reading and with the Lord's Prayer. Stores were closed on Sunday out of respect for Christian worship. Civic events often were started, and clergy would show up wearing a collar, even a robe, to pray for the event before it happened. Elected bodies often began their deliberations and decisions in their sittings with a Christian prayer. In the 1960s, in the church I grew up in, the minister of our church had a weekly radio show on the one radio channel in town. This no longer happens, right? Society has been shifting. Society went from being our partner in the Christian faith. Sociologist Peter Berger in the 1960s called it a sacred canopy, that there was a sacred canopy over all the activity in our society. And we've shifted from that to having a culture that actually erodes the Christian faith in people. Today, Christians, our children, our youth, live in what Charles Taylor, Canadian philosopher, calls a cross-pressured world. They feel the influence of their church upbringing, in their families, in church, nurturing Christian faith, that this is being cross-pressured by a number of things in the culture of our society, and overall, that voice of our society is winning. We have to remember how fast this change has actually happened. My parents' generation, they went to church as a matter of course because everybody went to church. My generation, baby boomers, we substantially went to church school as children, but most baby boomers dropped out of church involvement once they got out of their teen years. My children's generation substantially has not even gone to Sunday school. Just think of how fast that's changed in 2 generations. The historic chain of passing faith on intergenerationally is broken. So, growing secularism is the result of people dropping their Christian identity, becoming nunverts, and there's a growing number of people who just never ever had a Christian identity. And this is why that group of those who claim to have no religion is growing so quickly in this country. I'm going to pause here now again for comments. What's the impact on churches in Canada and in North America? Well, let's look first at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, particularly changes since the 1970s. And you'll see how how significant the decrease in membership has been, as well as how significant total worship attendance has declined in our denomination. So that right-hand column is the average attendance of all our congregations combined in those years. Membership decline has been 33% in the last 20 years. And the actual decline in the number of congregations we have in our denomination over the last decade is 24%. Now, let's not think that this is just a Presbyterian thing. There was a report to the Anglican Church in Canada in 2019 that projected that the denomination would not exist at all by the year 2040. All branches of all the branches of the Anglican Church throughout the world, the fastest declining branch is the one in Canada. But let's broaden the picture here. The Mormons in North America are in decline. The Evangelical Church in the United States has been in slow decline since 2000. In the United States, the Presbyterian Church, USA, has mostly held the #1 spot as the fastest declining denomination in that country. But sometimes over the last 20 years, they've been pushed into the #2 spot by the Southern Baptist Church, the denomination of Billy Graham. For several years of the last 20, it has been the fastest declining denomination. How do these statistics make you feel? I'm going to pause here. I just want you to type into the chat how these social trends make you feel. Why do you feel this way? For most congregants, it is the impact on their own congregation that fosters these feelings, not the trends for a country. For most congregations, it's because we want to sustain our congregations in the ways that we have found meaningful. And there's a growing bunch of people who don't find what we find meaningful. They don't find it meaningful. There's a growing number of people who are dropping out of our congregations because they no longer find it meaningful. The question is this the church's fault? Joel Thiessen is a sociologist, works at Ambrose University here in Calgary. He is the new Reg Bibby, and he's fabulous. In his book, The Meaning of Sunday, he wrote, "Stop blaming the churches. Factors beyond religious groups' control significantly account for diminished religious involvement and affiliation. Factors significantly beyond our control has caused this to happen." At its core, what has happened? The church in Canada hasn't quite realized how dependent we were on the culture of our society to help sustain congregations and to pass on faith intergenerationally. The dilemma is now that the church has to figure out how to do it on their own, how to do it despite our current and changing culture. How challenging will doing it on our own be for us? Well, I want to help you get a glimpse of that by looking at the emerging generation, let's say, people age 40 and under, and what they think about Christianity and what they think about church. So basically, for a good number of people who are 40 and under, they have no clue what happens in church. And consequently, they're not at all interested in walking into a congregation. They have very vague notions of what Jesus is about. They often believe that religion has been bad for the world. The church perpetuated, sexual abuse. The church were the ones running residential schools and such. You've heard all this before. We hear Jesus say, "I am the truth." For so many in our society, truth is relative. People individually choose what they think is true. A huge factor today is people's belief in their personal freedom to choose what they believe and to choose what they do. Over the years, people have had an increased capacity to choose things and to not be restrained by the mores of our society. And they believe that if they become part of a Christian church, they will lose some of their freedom. That they will be told, this is what you have to believe, this is how you're going to have to behave. And they're not willing to give up that freedom. Churches are seen as intolerant because people say the church promotes a single point of view. People who are spiritually interested say that they would never go to a church to have that spiritual need met. People today are spiritual tinkerers. Robert Wuthnow, sociologist, coined this idea that people today take little bits of spirituality from here, from there, and they cobble together something that's meaningful for them to get them through today and this week. And as bits become not so meaningful, they discard them, pick up something else. And so they are constantly revising their own spirituality based on what seems to work, what seems to be meaningful for us. Another thing is Canadians aren't joiners. And you see that in, the Masonic Lodge, people joining the YMCA, Scouts and Cubs and Girl Guides. People just don't join the way they did before. And ultimately, when people do not see any sense of evidence for the existence of God that they find compelling, we, the people of the church, are the greatest evidence for the existence of God. Secular society has been a long time coming. Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, world-renowned scholar, wrote an 800-page book on secularism, and looking at how our secular society in the West developed over 500 years. And he points to the church in the Western world as the catalyst so often for the development of our secular society. A great influence in the beginning was the Reformation, because the Reformation implied that faith was a choice. Martin Luther nailed his 95 critiques to the door of his abbey in, I think it was 1522. By the end of the 16th century, so 80 years later, people could choose between the Roman Catholic Church, Lutheran Church, Church of England, Reformed Church, and the Mennonites. The humanist perspective that is prevalent in our society today grew out of Christianity, and because people kept sort of the moral sensibility of Christianity, and they simply let the notion of God drift. Also, Charles Taylor says, we live in an age of authenticity, he calls it. Wrote a book on this 40 years ago. And Christianity has gone about shedding its coercive stance in society that, you must be this way, to be much more permission giving. And people have been building their own sense of who I am as a consequence. The church has been somewhat supportive of the notion of pluralism. Pluralism's the lubricant in a society where we're all individuals, that we say, what is true for you is fine, and what is true for me is fine, even if it's different. And the church has actually been an encourager of the idea of pluralism because, in a society that's growing more secular, we want to have the freedom to continue to be Christian. In conclusion, Charles Taylor says, is the loss of Christendom a loss? Yes, in some ways. Is the loss of Christendom an advantage to us? Yes, in some ways. There's a church consultant in the 1980s, very prominent, named Lauren Mead, and he wrote a book in 1991 about the situation that we faced in North America. He made some very bold statements about the life of the church. And it caused eyebrows to go up all around North America. Two of the things he said in the book: the dilemma of the church in this transitional time is that the shells of the old structures still surround us, even though many of them no longer work. Our task is no less than the reinvention of the church. It may take several generations. We will not see the end of it, but we must begin now. We are at the front edges of the greatest transformation of the church that has occurred in 1,600 years. It is by far the greatest transformation that the church has experienced in North America. It may eventually make the transformation of the Reformation look like a ripple on the pond. So we're going to have a chat time now. I'm going to break you into discussion groups. And I've put in the chat panel on the side this little bit here. And in your groups, thinking about what you've heard, I want you to ask, how do we think St. Andrew's is responding to this great change that is happening to the church? And, I want to see which one of these four categories you think fits us. First, are we just being resistant? We're just going to stay the course. We're going to ignore all this and just keep being who we are. Are we being reactive? This is about crisis management. We ask questions like, how do we cope? How do we maintain the church as it has been? Can we change in our attempts to stay the same? What can we change in our attempts to stay the same? A third one is being responsive. What we ask, responsive congregations ask, how do we become more relevant to people in our societies so we can attract them to come to church? Or, fourth category is reformation. It's about, are we reconceiving the very nature of the church? So I'm going to give you some time to think about that, come up with your answer, and I'll just ask, after we're back, I'll ask people to post perhaps a consensus view from your group. I like to end with a brief devotional reading from Matthew chapter 25, which is the parable of the stewards. And we're picking this up at chapter 25, verse 14. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. And one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to their ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. The master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come, enter into the joy of your master. So we know this parable well. We know that the master is Jesus. The stewards are us. And the master is going away on a long journey. And now in hindsight, we understand that to be Jesus' ascension up into heaven. Master returns with his return again at the end of the age. But in this interim time, the master has entrusted into these slaves, these stewards, all of his possessions. And what do those treasures really look like that have been entrusted to us? Well, it says all of Christ's treasures. So faith and its practice is entrusted to us. The gospel and the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives have been entrusted to us. The whole people of God, people of faith, have been entrusted to us. The mission of God has been entrusted to us. It is God's mission in which we participate. No matter what happens in changing society or what happens to the church, God will always be pursuing God's mission. And the good stewards are to make that treasure grow as we participate in God's mission. Now, the parable raises a real issue for us, because is it true that Jesus gives to us the treasure and then we return it to Jesus directly? Well, that's not the case, actually. We receive that treasure from the previous generation. We are to be stewards of it in our time, and then we pass that treasure on to the generation that follows us. And our problem is, what we want to pass on is no longer working. So our challenge is to figure out how to make this treasure grow so it can be handed on well to those who follow us. It is part of human nature that we do what psychologists call intergenerational discounting. We give priority to the needs of people in the here and now, and we have lower priority for those who follow us in the generations to come. Think about climate change and how slow we are to change our ways, and not think as well, as deeply, as with great concern for those who follow us. or business profits, which are often driven by, the next quarterly statement rather than the long-term well-being of the company, or governments who over time accumulate great government debts in order to provide for the electorate now stuff that they want. And we will penalize the generations to come who will have to pay that debt that we accrued. Here's the reality. The next generation of Christian faith communities is going to have it tougher than we do. We think we have it tough, but the generation that follows us is going to find it even harder. Kimberly Wade Benzoni, who's a psychologist who's worked on these things, she says that people in our society need to learn how to apply the golden rule over time. The golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do to you. Well, because we give in to intergenerational discounting, because we aren't as mindful of the needs of those who follow us, what Dr. Wade Benzoni is encouraging us to do is to expand our definition of the other so that it can now include the generation who follows us. Do unto them as you would have them do unto us. In the Apostles' Creed, we say we believe in the communion of saints. And that communion of saints talks about those who have preceded us in faith, but those who will follow us in faith. And if we truly believe in the communion of saints, we need to be mindful of that communion in the generation to come. We need to develop a longer view on the life of the church, not just how do we manage the impact society is having on our congregation this year, but to begin to ask the question, what do we need to do now for the sake of the church that follows us? What can we do now for their sake so that a generation from now they can look back and say, thank you? I opened with this idea that I wanted you to feel like James Bond's martini. And perhaps you have felt shaken. But is there reason for hope? Yes. And we'll be exploring that in the 2 weeks to come. And we must always remember that God is still God. God is still pursuing God's mission in the world, and that is not going to change. And the church, we're just called to participate in God's mission. We have to remember that the church is a vital tool God uses in the pursuit of God's mission in the world. And we'll look at that next week. And we have to take some contentment, some solace in the fact that, yes, generation from now, there will still be faith communities. Some may even look like St. Andrew's Church, but most will not. Future generations of church and faith community will likely look different. Those ones will seek to be more relevant in the society, seeking to serve the society in a different way than we do now. So where does that leave us in this interim time between how the church has been and how the church will be? My best analogy is that we need to be like, 16th century and 15th century explorers. They learned that the earth is not flat, but round, that there's no edge that they can sail off of and plummet into oblivion. But they had no idea what lay beyond the horizon. And they simply like Columbus, got on their ships, pointed west, and just go and see what they hit. This is a time of transition. It's a time of exploration to try to figure out how can we be faith communities now for the sake of the generation that follows us. And like those explorers of old, we may go out and hit something, hit a piece of territory, unimagined. And it's our job to make a map. Make a map of that place you discovered. Share it with others so we can build a more comprehensive map of the whole world. This is our calling. I look forward to next week's workshop, where we'll talk about the model of church that we've been relying on that's failing, and how the missional model of church is very helpful for our time and place. And we'll now shift into back into Zoom and a more of an open forum in discussion of what you heard here tonight. God bless.